Hi, my name is Gabriel Dozal, and I'm a poet and English and poet instructor at the University of Arizona.
I'm not a poetry nerd. Like, I don't know anything about poetry. Honestly, I think my poetry knowledge extends to like back in high school when we read poems once in a while and we learn about,
Sure,
you know, how to compose some of them in the basic
sure,
ways. But
yeah.
I don't really know poetry like that. And I feel like that's not going to be just me. A lot of our listeners probably are new to poetry
Hmm.
and they're intrigued by what it is, how it works, what makes it so cool, and not boring, I guess, in some
Hmm.
cases. So, can you give us like a poetry one-on-one? What if you were explaining this to someone imagine you're explaining poetry to a 10-year-old. How would you explain this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even just rewinding a little bit, um, I made the book so that you don't necessarily need to know or be a poetry nerd to understand, to engage with the book. Um, my goal was to write for a wide audience, but still maintain that poetry nerd element that I love, or like the elite poetry education that I have. Right, I have an MFA in poetry. I have a bachelor's degree in poetry. I spent my whole life reading and studying poetry. Right, but I think poets often do a disservice by often writing just for other poets. And I really wrote this book for as wide an audience as possible, right? I know not everyone will dig it, not everyone will be able to like sink their teeth into it, but I really tried. My goal was that my uncle Albert, my Tío Alberto, who didn't graduate high school, he was a groundskeeper in El Paso, Texas. He reminds me of like Cheech Marin, sort of. He's like this Cheech Marin sort of character, right? But he's just this lovely person. I wrote it so that he would be able to get something out of this book and understand it. Now, going back to your question about poetry, it's really line breaks. The way that the line can be shorter than in prose, right? Than in fiction or nonfiction. That's the biggest difference. And how poets manipulate and change those line breaks is kind of what makes that art form for me. Now, of course, there's metaphors, there's language play, there's puns, but that's not necessarily just poetry, right? We pun all the time. We make jokes all the time, right? That's not necessarily just a poetry thing. So I really hope I wrote it for, if you know nothing about poetry, I think you'll get a lot out of this book.
So poetry doesn't have to rhyme, because that's another thing that I feel like
Great.
is a misconception.
Man, well, check this out though. I mean, of course it doesn't have to rhyme, right? Or follow a regular like A-B rhyme scheme. But I also don't want to be afraid of rhyming either. I think a lot of writers, a lot of poets are afraid to rhyme, like as if it's some kind of old school thing. But here's something new that I've sort of discovered through Steven Pinker. He's a psycholinguist, and he talks a lot about how the brain works. He also talks a lot about art. He has a lot of books where he talks about art, and he talks about how um, artists shouldn't turn their back on what humans find attractive in art, right? And in poetry, it's repetition, it's rhyme, it's wordplay, it's playing with language. So this book explores all of that.
Okay. So repetition. So poetry is repetition, line breaks, wordplay, sometimes rhyming, sometimes not.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so tell me, what kind of poet are you? Like, is there a type of poet?
I mean, because I'm from El Paso, Juarez area, I'm a border poet. That's the type of the poet I am. But maybe border writer is better, right? Because I also want to try to blur the lines between poetry and prose, poetry and fiction. There's a section in the book that's written in prose. There's a little like short story prose section right in the middle of the book. So I don't know if what kind of poet I am, but I definitely like jokes and puns and wordplay and rhyming. Like the things that like are attractive to a reader.
Would you say that a hip hop artist is a poet? Like someone
Hundred
who
percent,
raps?
100%, 100%. Like I teach intro to poetry. I also teach composition. When I tell my students who don't know or haven't been introduced to poetry in a big way, And when they're writing their own poems, I say, hey, we're looking for bars. We're looking for something that's fire, right? We're looking for some lyrics that like get you going, that are exciting, that have energy, right? Or that say something that makes you stand up. So it's like, wow, what was that? That was interesting. That was cool, right? I mean, we're looking for bars here.
And here's the thing where I would say like poetry and lyrics from music differ a lot. It's like sometimes I feel that I can't really understand poetry. When I read a poem, sometimes it's very straightforward. And a lot of the time, it is not. So are poems meant to be not straightforward? Are they meant to confuse you in some way? I think that's why I have trouble with poetry sometimes. And I'm like
Yeah,
coming at this as a skeptic, right? Like I know that a
yeah.
lot of our listeners are gonna be like, oh, poetry is not for me. How do we make poetry for other, for people in general? Like how do we make it more accessible, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, these are things I'm very concerned with, Maribel. I want poetry to reach a wider audience. And like I said earlier, I think a lot of writers, a lot of poets have been writing just for other writers, right? So I want to offer, and I think the book does offer plenty if you don't know about poetry. But I think there's a couple of things. One is I've really tried to stay away from the theory language, critical theory type of language, right? Because poetry is already a condensed and dense form, right? It's already complex and it's built into the art form. But this is why I think it's interesting for our current moment for 2023. We live in a very complicated moment. It's hard to figure out what's going on sometimes. We have too much information. We have so much information, it's hard to parse, right? Poetry allows you to say multiple things at the same time. Poetry allows you to be of two minds at once. That's what the line break does. So I'll give a quick poetry lesson. Very simple concept here. I'm talking about line breaks, right? When you're reading a poem, it's not like prose, right? It doesn't go to the end of the line. A poet can cut off language throughout the poem, right? There's two types of line breaks: end stopped and in jammed. In jammed and end stopped line breaks. End stopped is when it ends with a period, or there's a natural pause at the end of the line. An enjammed line is when you cut off the line in the middle of a sentence to highlight a different part of the language. Now, by doing that, you create your own idea, your own thought in one line, and then when it connects to the next line, it creates a second thought. So you're able to add layers of depth here. And you're able to say 2, 3, 4 things with one line or two lines of poetry. So you can be of two minds of something. You can get across a very complex idea. Yeah. And so, but, I think that's important to understand when reading poetry. But poetry should be more straightforward. I want poetry to be more straightforward, right? I want poetry to be, here's one thing I talk with my students all the time. We have the technology. We can do this, guys. We can write poetry that is accessible to a large, large audience and still keep our elite poetry knowledge, right? This poetry education that we have. We don't have to keep it just for ourselves. We can do both things at the same time.
So there's a poem in the book that stumped me completely. It's the one on page 22. There are plenty of places where the border doesn't exist. Can you explain that one a little bit before you go into a reading of it?
Yeah. So with this poem, what I'm trying to do is play with this idea of the simulation and play with what it's like for not just someone to cross the border, but what it's like for someone to live their life through a phone or through social media, right? Like there's a lot of winks here. There's a lot of like little Easter eggs. For instance, there's a part where it says you see a cat and then you see it twice. If you're familiar with the movie The Matrix, this is one of the first scenes. One of the first things you see in The Matrix is like a cat, and there's like a glitch, and then the cat kind of comes through another time, right? There's also like stuff about journalism here, right? Like we're going to A/B test this crosser. A/B test is something that journalism does with headlines, right? They see which headline gets more engagement, right? And then they choose which headline they go with, right? I'm also playing with misheard language. From the border, you might hear a phrase in English, and you're a Spanish speaker, and then you mistranslate it, right? So, for instance, there's a line that says, "Our Father Halloween in Texas," right? That's supposed to be like, like that the prayer, right? Like our Father. I can't think of. Yeah, yeah. Hallowed be Thy name. Hallowed be Thy name. Our Father, hallowed be Thy name, right? Um, yeah. Yeah, and then like there's a question where it asks like, how many times have you clicked on yourself, right? How many
Oh.
times have you clicked on a photo of yourself, right? Like how many times have we Googled our name
Mhm.
and seen a photo of ourselves and like, whoa, I didn't see that photo. Where's this photo from, right? Also, when you're talking about the words fit inside of another word, right? Um, it's not here in this poem, but throughout the book, I refer to Rossers. So these are people who cross the border to come shop at Ross
Oh yes, I
because,
noticed that. I love that.
right,
I've never
right.
heard that term before.
Yeah, I made it up. I made it up. It's like, so, but hidden inside the word crosser is the word Rosser, right? That word is hidden inside that word, right? Now, I'm also commenting on what it's like to illegally cross things and people from one side of the border to the other, right? Like, I mean, I'm from the border. You hear all of these stories. I have family who have crossed plants illegally. I have friends who have crossed, drugs illegally. Might sound shocking, but it happens. Sometimes it happens accidentally. You might cross over with, some marijuana that's legal or, from the United States, and you forget about it and you're crossing it back over, right? Or all kinds of crazy stories. You living at the border, you hear about all of this world of crossing things legally and illegally. So I'm commenting on that. I'm commenting on our current culture. I'm commenting on how language works, on how there's words hidden inside of words. I create words, right? Like residiente. Residiente is not a real word in Spanish, right? It's a combination of tooth and resident, right? So I'm constantly playing with these language, and that's something that poetry is beautiful at doing. Poetry can say multiple things. I can bombard you with ideas, but hopefully I'm doing it in a fun way. Hopefully, like, you laugh or you think about your own kind of world at the same time.
Okay, let's hear you read this one for
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. There are plenty of places where the border doesn't exist. We are all post-host, post-hoc crossers. We've already crossed, but we have to give the appearance that we are new here. Our crossing is driven by our passions, and sometimes our passions cross without us. The great variety of ports of entry is what gives the border its charm. Well, if effectiveness means charm, then yes. See how I just fit one word inside another? Anyone can sneak these words past. Customs. For most crossers, the border app is the border. The poem is supposed to glitch here and be aware of its sewing and its poorly seamed, bedazzled jeans. I know you are already aware of the glitches in the border simulator. You see a cat, and then you see it twice. You see primitivo, and then you see primitivo twice. We're going to A/B test this crosser. What words get less engagement from customs? How many times have you clicked on a photo of yourself? Primitivo. Our Father, Halloween, and Texas. How should Primitiva play her hand? She tries to hide her hand with her other hand. One farm hand reveals the other. How many times have you clicked on yourself? Well, a picture of yourself, at least. Customs shows you a photo of you crossing the border. Is this you in the photo? It looks so much like you. It must be you. Primitiva was only interested in creepypasta stories about the border. But what was so creepy about the border simulator? It was creepy because of how quickly the definitions took refuge in the crossers. Collecting for so long, the language got so big that even me, primitivo, could fit inside its words. My favorite word is residiente, the combo of tooth and status, a ghost word, hidden in primitiva, the guest host of the border simulator. See how I just fit one word inside another? Anyone can sneak these words past.
Okay. All right. So what are you saying here? What's happening? Like break it down story wise.
Okay, so that's hard. That's hard to do because I'm saying all kinds of things here.
I know.
But I think that so there's several voices here, right? So like in the poem, you'll hear me say customs, and that means customs is speaking, right? Or when I say primitivo and I pause, that means primitivo is speaking. I I think one way I tried to make this poem and this book accessible is by speaking through voices or giving the poems more of a voice, right? So in here, customs is speaking about the border and the border simulator, which, you know, is on purpose a sort of a vague term. I don't ever really explain what the border simulator is exactly. But I do that on purpose so that the reader can imagine their own world. I'm really interested in how a reader experiences these poems in their own mind. What narratives, what worlds do you see when you read these poems, right? And that world is what I'm really interested in. What I meant from the poem, the story that I'm trying to tell, is actually quite simple. It's two siblings, Primitivo and Primitiva, which your Spanish-speaking listeners will know that this is, an older name,
Yeah.
right? Like people aren't really called Primitivo or Primitiva anymore, right? But it has a type of power, this name, that I really like, right? Because it means firstborn. It's like the first one in the border simulator. I'm also commenting on myself because I was born in 1984. I remember vividly what it was like before the internet, before screens, before social media completely changed our lives. The world was really different in 1997. And I remember this world vividly, right? So I'm commenting on the fact that I've seen technology pass me by, change my world, and me having to play catch up. So really, for me, that's what the poem speaks to. But I think for a reader, I think I want to take you on this journey of two brothers, a brother and sister, two siblings coming to the border and trying to navigate this world. And then there's a voice of customs who is kind of like the dark, evil enemy, right? Who's like poking fun at them, right? And that was important too, because I want there to be tension. I wanted there to be dark humor. I wanted there to be this friction from the voice of customs.
I love that. So something I didn't ask you before, and I want to kind of backtrack a little bit, is
Sure.
you named the book The Border Simulator. Is that why? Because of what you just said? Or do you have a different answer for that?
That's one of the reasons, for sure. The book is tricky. The book is a tricky book. You can read it and you can understand one level of it, for sure. I've wrote the book so that you can understand one version of this. But the more that you dig into the book, you're going to see all kinds of meaning pop up from the book, right? So part of the border simulator is a joke on myself, because after I left El Paso and Juarez, I lived in DC for a couple of years. I've lived here in Tucson. Once you kind of leave the border, which I didn't do until I was 26, I myself felt like a border simulator. Like I was representative of the border, right? And people saw me as some sort of representation or avatar or simulation of what it's like to be from the border. And then you start to spot things. You spot other people from El Paso and Washington, D.C., and you're like, oh my God, this person's from El Paso. Look at this, right? And what's it like to live at the border, right? I'm from there. It's like in my blood. It's hard to like escape what it is, right? So like the last book in the poem is called You've Always Been a Border Simulator, right? I feel like in my life, as I walk through the world, I'm simulating what it's like to be from, or maybe for other people, I'm simulating what it's like to be from the border. It's hard to define. It's hard to define what the border is. It's hard to define this intersection of culture, politics, money, families. It's an ever-shifting, morphing thing. And that's what the book is. The book shifts, it morphs, it changes. It's never easy to identify what exactly the border simulator is. And I think that parallels what it's like to be from the border.
Okay. All right, let's do one more.
Sure.
I think you mentioned, I haven't gotten there, but the last poem of the book, it's called You've Always Been a Border Simulator. So talk a little bit about what this poem talks about.
Yeah. Here's some interesting background information. The book was actually written in reverse chronological order. This poem, You've Always Been a Border Simulator, was one of the first poems I wrote in the Border Simulator kind of series, or in this kind of like collection. And then the very first poems in the book were some of the last poems I wrote as I was trying to introduce readers to the world, or trying to give readers more of like a foothold into the world, right? Yeah, but like I said, being from the border, and this is a tried and true trope about being from the border. You hear about this in the Selena movie, right? Where the dad is like, you have to know Mexican culture better than the Mexicans, and you have to know American culture better than the Americans, right? You go to Mexico and your family tells you you're not Mexican, but you don't feel American 100%, right? So there's this feeling of not feeling real, but not feeling simulated, right? You feel like the place that you belong is the border, right? So there's that there too, but I'm also trying to include ideas about technology, what it's like to experience the border through videos on YouTube, through video games. I'm also talking about the trials of anyone who comes to the border for a better life. So yeah, those are some kind of those main elements that are in this poem. All right, here we go. You've always been a border simulator. Resident, never real or simulated, and the crossers see that you're not real or simulated, and they're not sure if they are a mural of rural crossers. You simulate what a person with papers would say, would act like, so that you can cross over. Your accent is hard to understand. You have trouble saying your name, and you say it anyway. Customs are suspicious because you can't say your name. So they take you in and make you paint murals of crossers at the border. The murals warn crossers of what might be waiting for them, the unswerving future, an 8-bit desert. All day you paint in the border simulator portraits of crossers, and their portrait is their face, covered by a phone. You paint murals of crossers going into the simulation. Their faces also covered by their phones, but you can see their eyes, and they're scared of crossing. You ask them to pretend there is water. They can only pretend there is water so long. After your service to the simulator, you practice traversing your words, or the simulation traverses you. This simulation isn't a question of fake or reality, but a performance of saying your name. If the simulation survives, you also survive, and you keep it alive by crossing. The simulation exists because you cross into it and you love the threshold. When you speak of the border simulator, you're really speaking about blank, how a $sign can open up a whole new world of crossing. You go to the front of the line, Customs asks you less questions. In simulation, you can pay off la policía. It's harder to do that in reality, but it's not the result you want. And the simulation is a results-based game. When you speak of the border simulator, you're really speaking about the X, where the two worlds meet.
Nice. Okay. So I have a question.
Yeah.
What I'm very literal.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why poetry sometimes like just goes over my head. But what is he painting or what are you painting here? When you're saying like you paint in the border simulator all day long, you paint in the border simulator.
Yeah. So throughout the book, there's this made up situation where as you cross the border, customs makes you paint portraits and murals of other crossers. Now, this is a completely made up situation, right? This doesn't actually exist, right? But I'm commenting on what it's like to be from the border and to be expected to write about the border, expected to create art about the border. You know, I've wrestled with this my whole life. You get pigeonholed as a border writer. I've taken 100 creative writing classes. Every instructor says, you should write about the border. You need to write about being Mexican American. Part of this book, Maribel, is me poking fun at that a little bit, right? The customs agents are constantly shifting. Yes, I'm talking about real customs and border patrol agents. Sometimes I'm talking about the powers that be that expect you to write about something. So it's kind of like a meta poem where I'm poking fun at that, where they're like, hey, paint murals about these crossers. Paint about them. Talk about them. Right? Now, here's the thing. I also love my people. I love being from the border. And I do want to write about these things, right? It's a complex, mixed emotion that I have, right? So that's part of what that small little situation is in the poem.
I really love that. Because I know that so many people feel that way. And exactly as you described, you are of this ethnicity, therefore you should only write about this ethnicity and your people and the things that you know and the places you come from. And we're not allowed to explore beyond that, which is also why poetry in this scenario is so intriguing to me. Because I do not think that as Latinos, we spend a lot of time reading poems. And at least I don't. And I don't want to make a generalization, but I think that it is just not something that we are grown up to or raised to believe that we should do, like read poetry. And so
Yeah.
I think it's perfect. It fits perfectly. You know, how do we make poetry more accessible, but also how do we let people know that it's okay to write about other things besides their own personal experiences?
Absolutely. And again, going back to what we were talking about poetry is complex sometimes, but these are complex ideas that I'm trying to get across, right? It's something I wrestle with in myself about being from the border, writing about the border, right? And I'm embracing it and poking fun of it at the same time. This is something that poetry allows you to do uniquely, right? I can be of two minds of something because of those line breaks. I can say one thing and then I can break the line and say something else on that line. But also one more thing, Maribel, here. I mean, I think it's up to poets and writers to make it more accessible, right? Like, we have to compete with movies, social media, all of these things that are way cooler than our art form, right? I think we need, I mean, or not we, maybe I shouldn't make big generalizations about poetry, but me, myself, just me. My goal is to make poetry and writing, because I want to write prose and fiction and nonfiction also, but I want to make it as dynamic, as energetic, as readable, as accessible as possible, while still having a high art form, an art form that offers a lot of depth to the reader. I want to have it both ways, Maribel, and I know we can do it.
I love it. I'm down for it.